Welcome to Conversations in Bioethics, a podcast series in which we discuss contemporary bioethics issues with Cleveland State faculty and other professionals. I'm Dr. Toni Nicoletti with the Department of Philosophy and Comparative Religion at Cleveland State.
And I'm Dr. Sonia Charles, also with the Department of Philosophy and Comparative Religion at Cleveland State.
And today we're going to talk about the issue of using in vitro fertilization for the purposes of sex selection. And let me give a little bit of background to that, and then we'll jump into the articles that we're going to focus on, which are critiques of the practice. And we'll give a little overview of their arguments and discuss the content of the articles. So the using in vitro fertilization for sex selection is the only guaranteed method of determining the sex of a child. There are, of course, other methods that people can try that are really folk remedies. There is sperm sorting, so that would be another medical procedure. We're mostly going to focus on the use of in vitro fertilization with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And I think we're largely focusing on cases in which people are using it for non-medical reasons. So they don't have a genetic disease that's tied to sex. And even I think in cases where people are just going to the clinic for that reason and not because, but I think we could cover it also that maybe somebody's already using in vitro and then they also are using this PGD and selecting the sex. And the question basically is, should fertility clinics institutionalize this, or should, the medical community allow this? In the United States, it is not illegal, and it's also not very tightly regulated. So there aren't really a lot of statistics about how many people are using it strictly for that purpose, or even using it for that purpose at all, because clinics do not have to report why people are using their services. In other countries, for example, in England, choosing the sex of a child is banned. And the two articles that we're focusing on, these are both feminist critiques of the practice of sex selection through in vitro. And they are both basically using an argument about the mistaken belief of gender essentialism. And the article that I have here is A Feminist Critique of Justifications for Sex Selection by Teresa Hendel. And that was in Bioethical Inquiry in 2017. And she just outright, I'll read what she says, how she defines gender essentialism: the practice of assuming that a certain set of traits or particular personality follows from one's sex. And so basically it's the idea that if you have the chromosomes of a male or female, then you will also be a girl or boy. I don't know if I said that in the right way.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. So the idea is that the sex of the child determines the gender of the child.
Right.
The sex being male or female, the gender being boy or girl.
Yeah.
And the view, I think, in this article, but also I think in yours too, was that basically this practice and allowing it in the medical community is reinforcing a harmful belief that people have in society. Do you want to introduce yours and give us a little overview, and then I can come back and overview a little hers
So I
too.
think the article I read was also, it looks like this was part of one big symposium, and you read the main article, and this looks like a kind of follow-up or piece with that. So mine was How Sex Selection Undermines Reproductive Autonomy by Tamara Kayali Brown. And hers, again, much like the other one, she's arguing against this gender essentialism and how this sex selection reinforces it. Her main argument, she says, I argue that by basing its very existence on the assumption that the sexes are not interchangeable, sex selection reduces autonomy in two ways. It clouds parents' perceptions of what is possible in parenting, and it entrenches the current social pressure to raise the sexes in very different ways. So she spends some time talking about what kind of expectations parents have when they try to use this sort of technology, and how that limits their ideas and what kind of relationship they can have with a boy child versus a girl child, and those sort of classic gender stereotypes. But then she also is concerned about how that gender dichotomy plays out socially in a broader way. So she also comes back at the end and talks about parents who are trying to have more broad views of how they raise their children, and how this gender essentialism also reduces their autonomy. So like a woman who's trying to raise her boy to be open more than just traditional masculinity kind of traits, and the kind of pressures he gets at school and ostracism. And so she's concerned about those kind of broader social implications as well. So.
Yeah, okay. And I think that Hendel's article also covers that kind of territory about the mistaken ideas here. And a lot of her view, well, she spends a lot of time in this article offering what are the arguments for the practice. Mm-hmm. And so she covers a number of theorists who support it: John Harris, John Robertson, Julian Savulescu, and Wilkinson, but I don't have the first name there. And for example, Julian Savulescu is a big proponent of procreative autonomy. He's very against the tighter regulations in Europe, and I think he might be Australian, but if they have him there.
Where he's actually from,
yeah.
But yeah.
But he's against these tighter regulations, and he thinks that people should be allowed to select the best children if they're undergoing IVF, and there's better, they should have all the data that they need to select the best children for themselves. They should be allowed, of course, to select out diseases and things like that. And he thinks that the only limits, this is coming from something else from Savulescu, he thinks the only limits we should really place on people's procreative autonomy when it comes to utilizing these services is if it's likely to harm society. And so he says that, for example, if somebody wants to create a psychopath, I don't know if you can pick that gene out, then that would be wrong. Okay.
Right.
And I do think he says that it's okay to ban it in a country where the ratios are way out of whack already with boys and girls.
Because I guess that would be a kind of harm to society.
That is a harm to society.
Fixating.
Okay. But on the other hand, he says, I had a quote here from a video I was listening to. There was this little special on YouTube about the perfect being or the perfect child or something like that. And Savulescu says, hey, a couple people in Europe picking a boy because they have two girls or vice versa. What's the big deal? Okay, right. So he thinks people should be allowed to use their preferences. Some of the territory that Hendel covers here is this idea that people should be allowed to pick based on their preferences. Also, these procreative autonomy theorists will cite articles where people just really want a boy or they just really want a girl, and they should just be allowed to do that if that makes their life, and I think they have a very subjective view of happiness and the good, which is satisfying your own preferences. And if that's what will satisfy them, then they're better off just going ahead and doing it. And then, so that's kind of the overall idea here. She does have one interesting argument at the beginning that I kind of like, where she says, I think maybe it's Savulescu, but I'm not positive, one of these, who says, hey, people have been trying all these methods anyway. This is just the next step. And she says you can't equate this technology with just the next step, because they're different in kind. One is a way of determining it that's very different from hoping or eating some kind of food that's supposed to make your body chemistry,
more conducive
to a boy or a girl, whatever those are. And so she says you just can't say that this is just another manifestation of that hope, because you are now.
And then that, of course, gets into the Dina Davis argument about a lot of these technologies, right? Where she's like, the more you invest in it, then the more you want a return on your investment.
Right.
So if you spent thousands and thousands of dollars in sex selection IVF to get a boy or a girl, and then that child doesn't match the kind of expectations you had, Dina Davis is going to argue that, that's going to be more problematic than, you're right, just sitting around having a glass of wine or eating spicy food or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. It's going to be one hard to uncover, because that's such a matter of psychology. Do we have the studies on that? But anyway, so in her positive argument, Hendel she does cite this gender essentialism as basically a reason for people citing why they want to choose a boy or a girl. And so I even had gone online and looked up, just kind of plugged in people who choose the sex of their baby, if there were interviews with people and what their reasons were. And at least in a couple, I mean, this is so obviously minuscule and anecdotal, but there were definitely these stories about people who would just outright say some people actually said, I don't care if she's straight, gay, I don't care if she ends up being very tomboyish. There's just this bond you can have with a daughter that you don't have with a son. It's a different kind of bond. And definitely in the article, Hendel cites people who think that about a boy, of course, the football player, the jock, that kind of thing. And then the one story I was telling you about before we got started that I just found really fascinating, I do have to say. Well, actually, one of the things that sparked my interest in this was when I was teaching a class, and we were going to talk about this in it. And there's the couple, I don't know if you're familiar with Chrissy Teigen and John Legend.
Oh, yeah.
And what I thought was interesting about it was that not only did they use sex selection, I'm still not.
Did they really?
They
I didn't
did.
know that.
Yes.
Oh.
And I'm still not clear. I thought they needed in vitro anyway, and then they were using PGD, and they found out the sex. But then when I went back to do a quick look, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm going to go on that, but I'm not positive if they did it for that or just did it for gender selection. But I'm thinking it's the former, but I could be wrong. I'm not an expert.
No, that's fine. I just didn't realize they'd done that.
Well, yeah, and it actually made headlines in 2015 or 16 because she was at some event saying, I'm pregnant, and she was very early on and saying, and I'm going to have a girl. And so they were saying, and yes, indeed, she is going to have a girl because she basically gave interviews saying, I just thought John needed a girl. That's such a special kind of bond.
So that would have been their first kid, too.
And it was their first.
Yeah.
And then they went back and had the boy. Right. So it's not just a coincidence that they have a girl and a boy, that sort of ideal norm of the boy and the girl. They did do that on purpose. What I thought was interesting about when I first came across it was how out she was about it. I mean, in these other stories, people wanted anonymous names. They didn't really give it out.
Right.
So this one story, a woman, the best I could follow it, went through 7 or 8 cycles.
Wow.
To have a girl. She had 2 sons, and this was the headline. So this part has to be right, I guess. Is they spent $100,000 to have a girl. The first attempt were all the embryos tested to be boys. The second had a girl, but she miscarried. They didn't really detail the other attempts, but she ultimately was pregnant with a girl. And she did say, my will for a daughter and my husband's support was fundamental. But she does make reference to just her will and, the Dina Davis kind of, this is beyond drinking red wine and hoping, It's a will, too.
No, that took some effort.
Right. That took effort. We know in philosophy there's a difference between hope and intention, right? And that definitely hits it, whatever it is, whatever the fuzzy lines are, that hit it. And she did say they obviously must have had enough money because the sacrifices they made were not basic necessities, but they stopped having 3 vacations and only had 1, and they gave up getting a pool so that she could have another attempt. And then and then the quote I thought was kind of interesting, Vincent and my sons are thrilled for me. So it is very clearly, there's a narcissism to this story, certainly, and, focus on what she wants.
So I don't know, maybe we could talk, I don't know if there is, my article actually does cite some other research because she has a whole section on reasons for seeking sex selection, right? And a lot of it is this idea of a mother-daughter bond or a father-son bond. And, she claims there's different personality traits and different roles. I was sort of curious about this because I have to say I really kind of went back and forth when I was reading this article. I'm certainly... I know the feminist arguments about gender essentialism being wrong, and I agree, you can't do a one-to-one comparison kind of thing. But it is the case that in our society, there's a correlation, like if you're a parent and you're trying to up your odds of certain kinds of experiences. But then I also sort of stepped back and I was trying to think about what is the kind of experience? Like, what do we really mean when we're thinking about like that father-daughter bond? Because like this woman, she said, I don't care if she's a tomboy. I don't care if she's gay or whatever. I just want that mother-daughter bond. And I almost wonder, like, is it something more like, I don't know, phenomenological or how you can explain it? And then I started thinking
it's
about...
like an urge.
Well, there's an urge, but I don't think it's just that. Like, I think there's something else there. And I'm just going to put this out there. Like, I'm not defending gender essentialism, and I'm not even sure there's probably all kinds of ways we could critique this kind of experiential thing I'm trying to, like, articulate. But, so, for example, I was teaching a class a couple years ago, and I was relating this Twitter story about, like, this woman and this guy came to her house while like she was there by herself and wanted to look at this washing machine she had for sale. And then he was like, she was helping him carry it out. And it's this so convoluted story. But at one point she says she looked up at him and saw this look on his face and she just knew like the situation had turned and everything was fine. So I'm telling this story in class and almost all the women in class are like nodding. Like I know they get it, right? Like that, like how do you articulate that kind of... But I know a lot of that comes from growing up in a certain culture, right? Like that's not coming out of our genes.
Right.
So I don't know. I wasn't quite sure
so
how
you're
to parse
saying
some of that, right?
even though you agree with this idea that gender essentialism is wrong, and I think you could just look around to see that it's not binary. There isn't just boy and girl.
Right.
And, there is a mistaken belief there. But you're saying that even when the woman could say, I don't care if she ends up like this or she ends up like that, but there's still just something different. And in fact, when I was thinking about that quote, I was thinking about people I know people who have 2 and 3 of the same sex. And there's inevitably, or often enough, a discussion at some point about, I really had wanted one girl, couldn't one, I had wanted one, but of course they're really good parents.
Sure.
But then once they get past they're all boys or they're all girls, they really do start differentiating. So a lot of people say, well, we want variety, we want balance. But people, and Hendel says this in this article, that there are other ways of balancing. One is more introverted, one is more athletic. I mean, there's...
Sure,
And I have a friend who...
Because all kids have their own personalities in all kinds of ways. Right.
Yeah, and so even if they're all boys, there will be one that, this one really sticks by me, this one's much more independent. And so they kind of have that bond that you think of having with a girl and a mother,
right? But
maybe a boy and a mother have that, or a daughter and a father have it, the special bond. So there's other kinds of special bonds, but people sort of retain this. Even when they have that, they'll still say, well, but I kind of had wanted that mother-daughter bond, but they're having...
Like what that means, right.
And what it means, I
know, I have a hard time trying to think about that. But then on the other hand, I definitely see her argument in the value of denying this kind of gender essentialism and encouraging that denial on, because like I say, the kind of experience I'm trying to articulate comes from growing up in a culture that recognizes a gender dichotomy, which gets to the second half of this article, where if we start trying to push against that, then it's going to make those pressures on parents and kids, it's going to open it up more. So maybe it wouldn't have to, right? It would be easier to allow kids to break out of those sort of boxes, so to speak.
Right.
In the way that she's wanting parents to be able to do.
Yeah. And then in this article, too, I think the gist of both of these being that, if nothing else, that fertility clinics should not be reinforcing it. But we also know that, or at least, I mean, there's articles that I think you have to pay attention to just on in vitro fertilization itself, where it does reinforce certain norms about families, and clinics can reinforce those. So I wonder, and yet we aren't arguing that in vitro should go away, because it has been an important mode for many people to have children. So oftentimes now the critique will be about certain ways in which it can reinforce race or certain norms about families and things like that, and trying to go against that, but not necessarily saying we should abolish for in vitro practices. Right. So in this case, the question is it a harmful reinforcement of that idea? And then if it is harmful, then we should abolish it. But is it harmful to the extent that to society or to the children being born to this, such that we have a reason to abolish it outright rather than maybe screening individuals?
Right. Yeah, I have to say, I mean, by the end of this article, so here I'm of two minds, because I was fairly convinced that she's right. Like, if we allow non-medical IVF for just sex selection, then you're giving a certain kind of medical, like, she wants to argue like there's nothing evidence-based in that medical practice, right? Because certain sex chromosomes don't correlate to certain gender chromosomes. So we shouldn't allow it because it's basically like not evidence-based medicine, quote unquote, right?
Are you also just then allowing people, because people will come in and say, I have 3 boys and I just really want a girl.
Right.
And even though the physician knows, are they allowing them to use a service on the basis of mistaken beliefs?
Well, yeah, I think that's what she's saying. So from that standpoint, I was fairly convinced. So when we were like, okay, let's talk about the policy, should they be allowed or no? My first intuition is to say, no, we should say you can't do this just for non-medical reasons. But then there's nothing stopping all these other people who are using IVF for other reasons, and then they just could add on, right? Well, of those 3 very nice looking embryos, give me the one that's the little boy or the little girl, right? And so then it's like this group can't, but this group can, right?
So you're saying there's no way really you're going to control it entirely.
Right.
And so if you limit it for non-medical reasons, then you're kind of privileging the people who have a fertility problem, and then while they're in the midst of trying just to have a child at all, you're allowing them. Yeah, I've thought about that too, because when could you really regulate at any point if you've done the work and you know that these are boys and these are girls, because this is just part of the genetic workup when you use PGD. So it's there. And then there was one article I was reading at one point, or a video, it was prior to this, so I don't remember it exactly, but there was a story where a woman was saying, I knew they knew what they were, and she said, when they turned to me and said, I think they asked her, do you want us to implant a boy or a girl? And she said, I really didn't necessarily want to choose, but I didn't want someone else choosing for me at that point.
So then she was given a choice she didn't even want.
She was given a choice she didn't want, which I don't think that's necessarily the norm, but she was given a choice she didn't necessarily want, but then she made the choice because she said, why should he or she, I don't know who the fertility doctor was, why should that person make the decision at this point? Well, I may as well. Now, they could do
no, definitely.
They don't have to choose it either.
So here's the other thing I was thinking about in the kind of distinction I was making for like, oh, maybe we shouldn't do it, but then it's going to open this. So both of these articles are really worried about this belief in gender essentialism and how it, affects the broader society. And if that's what they're really worried about, we would have to go even further, right? Because now, even beyond IVF, what is becoming the normal prenatal testing, right? Where they can do the blood test at like 9 or 10 weeks. And those are talking about getting like full chromosomal makeups. People will be able to know their gender at like 10, 11 weeks in pregnancy. And if you're really worried about gender essentialism, we might want to argue nobody should know the sex before it's born, because now we're like already reinforcing gender norms before the kid's even here. Right. If what you're really worried about is the connection between gender essentialism and certain kinds of social pressures,
right?
Which then just gets huge.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And one of the stories I read on the internet of a couple who, I think they had 3 boys, and they were in England. This particular story was about people in England who are coming to the U.S. because it's banned there. And there are these clinics in California that it's like a full service thing. They'll help you with hotel arrangements, airline arrangements.
Oh, yeah.
They'll get you started on your medications or something to that effect. And she was talking about knowing the sex of her 3 boys, when people find out the sex. And she said, my husband is whatever their positions were, they were pretty lofty. And she said, we just have taken control in our whole lives. Can you imagine me not knowing? Or, and so it was this idea that she said, even the thought of me holding out and not finding out was so artificial because the knowledge was was there or something. And so you're right, it is kind of all part and parcel of at least in a family resemblance kind of way. Part of the thing. Oh, and also, I wanted to mention, too, because what a lot of people will use as a reason for not, and I think this should be addressed, Hendel in this article addresses it, a lot of people will say that one reason for not allowing the practice is because it will reinforce these stereotypes that can be harmful, in particular to women. And the thought is that people will largely want boys. And the statistics show that there is not a wide preference for boy or girl, and that, in fact, it slightly, in some studies, favors where people want a girl. And there were a couple articles. I was really shocked at the way that the one woman was saying, now granted, this is the woman who had 8 or 9 attempts, that anybody who has a child just, of course, wants a girl at some point. And now most people would think it's the opposite. I was really... see how we all hold just such individual beliefs about these things and what we assume.
It's true. And I've heard both ways, like, oh, girls are easier, boys are easier. And I've always just sort of been like,
children are hard.
Yeah,
don't
children
let anyone
are hard.
kid you. Raising children are hard. But what I was going to say is, so people will say that also a big reason for wanting sex selection is family balance. We have a boy, we want a girl. We have 2 girls, we want 2 boys. And what Hendel says is that stuff is kind of irrelevant. It's not so much family balance. It's just that even if you want to balance out a family because you have boys and now you want girls, you have this mistaken essentialist idea that the only way to get variety is to get the gender or the sex you want, because that will also produce a certain kind of gender, a softer, more feminine, to counter the masculine energy or something like that. Although I do think you and I already talked about this idea that people can even recognize that they have variety with one sex of personality, and yet there's still something they just crave about.
No, I think I do kind of, like, I get that there's something people crave, but I think that's kind of why I wanted to, I don't know what's a better word, meditate on it a little bit, because I'm not sure what it is they crave. Like I say, I don't think it invalidates the gender essentialism. It speaks to more the gender dichotomy in our culture, right? So if you're recognized as a boy or recognized as a girl, you're going to have certain kind of experiences that will create a bonding experience with your parents that are recognized as a man or a woman, right? And so I get, like, part of what some of the feminist arguments are is to break up that and make it more diverse. And so I kind of get that. But then it also becomes a kind of chicken egg, right? We currently have it, and that's what some of the parents are looking for in that bonding experience. What is the best way to start getting more diversity and allowing, the sensitive boys to not be picked on, or the tomboyish girls to not be picked on, and that kind of thing.
And then does the allowing these, and by the way, the number of people using the service is still relatively low. And also anecdotally, people who think that people shouldn't be selecting have just a bias against it that they can't always articulate either. Like, people should just be happy with what they get, or if they need in vitro, they should just be happy to have a healthy baby and not worried about that. I think that's oversimplistic as well. I thought too that what you had mentioned earlier, and I think Hendel has some of this in here, is it the case that even if we don't want to prevent people from doing certain things or hoping, and I mean, we can't regulate hope, right? Is it that the more you have invested in it? So in this article that Dina Davis has, which is primarily about whether or not people should be allowed to select for deafness, because some people want to use fertility clinics to create a deaf child because of their being steeped in deaf culture and wanting to promote that and keep that going in their family. Towards the end of the article, she doesn't spend a lot of time on it, but she says the same arguments that I'm saying, that you don't want to block the child's right to an open future. So she thinks selecting for deafness is wrong because it blocks the child's
to an open future,
to these possibilities. The same things hold for selecting the sex. And she says that if somebody's that invested in creating a child of a particular sex, then they are going to be so invested in raising it in a certain way that it is harmful to the specific child. And I think thus far we've addressed the more of it in terms of a societal level and breaking down these norms. But what about this idea of the harm to that specific child? Now, this is what I wanted to say would be where I see a gap in Hendel's argument. She wants to criticize gender essentialism or some type of determinism about, that if it has the male chromosome, it's a boy, et cetera. But she does give statistics to show that people do seem to overall have these beliefs when they go into this. But she then also kind of assumes this determinism about how that child will be raised, that what happens in pregnancy and prior to. And you and I have talked quite a bit about, as people who have children, how your expectations of whether it's about boy, girl, forget that. They're just blown away once you have a child and you start dealing with the day-to-day. And at least on the one hand, I don't see evidence here. I don't think there's a logical or a necessary connection. And I don't also see evidence that people who are going to do this are so predisposed to control that child's outcome that we have, as a whole, a good reason here to say that the practice is itself harmful to those specific children. Now, I think individually it could be that way. I think this woman who went through 7 or 8 attempts, I might be definitely questioning her.
I mean, I wonder what would happen with that woman if this daughter becomes 2, 3, 4 years old and decides she's transgender and identifies as a boy. What's going to happen to that poor woman? Then, which I think is part of the worry with some of these kind of arguments. But yeah, I never my intuition finds some merit in Dina Davis's argument. Like, it seems logical, like it makes some sense. But then you're right. I think some of it also comes down to individual parenting styles, because this woman seemed to be interested in something a little more ambiguous, right? She seemed more open to the personality of the child, whereas you have plenty of other parents who don't do any of this, but yet are very strict about gender norms and the way they raise their children just based on the children they happen to have. Right.
Well, and also I would say, like, okay, I haven't seen I don't follow Chrissy Teigen, but they seem like a fine family. I haven't seen any signs of some type of controlled experiment. But if they end up somewhat living a stereotyped life, and I can't say that I think there's reasons to block that outright. I mean,
I don't know.
It has to tip over a certain spot.
I don't think you could say just because parents are doing this that they're going to be horribly rigid about gender norms and expectations. Because, like I said, I think that's why I keep going back to the idea that it sort of depends on parenting styles in general, right? Like, there are certain parents who just are more traditional and are going to enforce gender norms. And then you have these other parents, too, if you're thinking about childhood expectations, who could do no assisted reproductive technology, but they get their son and they're like, my son's going to be a basketball star. And just like, from like age 3, they make them run laps and practice whatever, right? So you get those sort of parenting expectations. It can happen separate from this, for sure, in all kinds of ways.
Right. And I guess the question still kind of comes back to that we don't feel prepared to answer is what reason do we have to believe that letting people do this individually at clinics, to what extent does it reinforce a bad practice or something that needs to be banned, that it's bad enough that it needs to be banned? Or
I see what you're saying. I don't know. Are we going to be like the typical philosophers, I guess, and not have like an answer, right?
Yeah, that comes in the article. This is the thinking of it out. But I'm definitely sympathetic to their critiques. One semi-answer or one semi-thing I would say right now, as I'm sometimes about baby steps, and I think that maybe it's the screening at the door anyway. And I think there has to be the screening, if something is under some type of psychological or some kind of screening that would show individually somebody is likely to harm a child or has nefarious.
Oh, I see.
Like
what you're saying.
Octomom.
So like why, like the parent their particular intentions and what's going on there. I see
Yeah,
what you're
is,
saying.
I'm not even sure how you do that or what you do at the point that you think, boy, they really seem like they're going to try to raise, Barbie doll or something. But yeah, I'm saying that there's other methods other than just banning the practice outright, and of course socially just ourselves not reinforcing those ideas and getting more wider social acceptance so that people don't even care about this kind of but it's so hard
and it is hard, like, where you start with that. And I do think, I think that's one of the problems. Again, like, I am sympathetic, and part of me wants to say yes, like, we should not be allowing this kind of thing. But as what I think it was someone you quoted earlier, the woman from England, right? She's right in the sense that this has been a general trend with a certain segment of society, right? Like, people who have a certain amount of wealth and participate even beyond assisted reproductive technology, although I think some of the things going on there reinforce it. There's other articles, just this sort of middle-class sense of control. Like, I'm going to pick when I have my baby, what's going to happen, and it's just, this is like one more layer that's getting added onto that just sort of general mentality that probably could be used to get broken up a little bit, because you're right, like, then when it doesn't turn out right, whatever reason,
in an odd way, this reading all this and thinking about all this led me back to the helicopter generation, helicopter parenting generation. And also, I think Michael Sandel, he makes that distinction between transforming love and accepting love. And accepting love is, and he says parents need both. Transforming love is what helps you work towards and promote a child's well-being. It's what causes you to help them with their education and get them educated and do things, right? And then, of course, accepting love is just accepting somebody as they are. And you need the right balance there. Any generation is going to, of style of parenting, as you said, there's individual styles of parenting, but there's generational styles. And so the helicopter parents already had moved in this direction of transforming love. And interestingly, I was listening to another podcast, and the person in the podcast was talking about some of the people who are in their early to mid 20s now. And he was talking about them in the workplace and saying that this is the group that was shuffled to everything. You were shuffled into the basketball team, then you were shuffled home to do homework. You were told where to go. And he said that one of the issues they see in these people in finding careers in workplace is it's not that they don't want to work, and it's not that they aren't ready to do things, but that they're waiting for somebody to give them their direction, because that's what their life has been. Now, in my parenting, I think mine was more accepting love and
oh no, there's multiple, what is it, all joy and no fun, free range kids. Like, there's multiple books now that talk about this generation. I think it's generational and socioeconomic, though. It's like it's not everybody in the generation, right? And so, like, children, you're right. I was raised very differently too. We had tons more free time. We were much more independent. And now, like, and I struggle with this in my own parenting. Like, it's the norm now that children are a project, and you need to be guiding them in very specific ways, and even if you're not total helicopter, quote unquote, parenting. But
I think that is it. I think her name is Jennifer Singer, that All Joy No Fun. Have you read that book?
Yeah, I did. It's Jennifer. I forget her last name. I feel bad now.
It's a good book.
It's a very good book. It was very good.
And you're right. She does say this is really a study on middle class parenting.
Right.
And it is about this helicopter-ish.
But it's not even just helicopter-ish. Like, she talks about it in terms of this sort of like an arms race, because it's gotten the workforce has gotten so competitive, so we have to have all these curriculars so you get into the proper college, so that when you get in the proper college you can get the proper job, and like it's just this sense of scarcity that you have to maximize your kid in so many ways for them to have the best chance in life or something.
And I think the word you used is good. It's a very project oriented. I don't think my parents looked at raising us as a project. It was more, this is kind of what you do. And I was a while ago listening to an interview with a celebrity, and they were asking about his child, and he said, well, I had a good childhood. It was feral. And I thought that's a great way to think about parenting in the 70s and 80s, that it was just free reign. And and that had its own troubles too. I mean, so
Yeah,
I do
there's
think what
pros and
Sandel
cons.
says, you need a balance. And then the
Yes.
question, I guess the way I could put this question is, what practice is just pushing people way too far in the direction of transforming love so
Right.
that it really does become more of a sinister kind of project? I don't know how sinister it has to be to want to.
So if we want to sort of wrap up some, I think between my own thoughts and our conversation, again, I'm very sympathetic. Part of me wants to say we shouldn't allow this, but then part of me is like, at the moment, maybe you're right, that isn't quite the best step because there's all these other pressures and we might want to think about other ways of disrupting this whole sort of pressures in the direction it's going. And that I don't have a good answer to immediately, right?
Yeah, I
That's a
definitely do
$1 million
not.
question, how we'd have the counter to sort of push back on some of this in various ways.
Yeah, yeah.
But
So I
it
guess
seems
that's
wrong,
a-
like you say, to just randomly punish this handful of parents who are sort of doing their thing when all these other people will be reinforcing the same kind of things or
Right.
being able to choose
And just
in
not
their
having
way.
the evidence to,
Right.
To find out, and if we had more, I was looking for more evidence with people who did this and now the kid's 18 or 20.
Oh,
and
that it would be
reflective.
detrimental to the kid.
And
I
was
see what
it
you're
detrimental
saying.
or the
Right.
parents' reflections on, well, that didn't go the way we thought,
Right,
thought we
right.
picked this girl and then she's, took off for another country and isn't the stay-at-home thing. But I didn't find any of that. So, yeah, it would be nice if you had even
Right, I see what
that
you're
evidence.
saying.
But then
Yeah.
there is a societal issue, too, of breaking it down. So it could still be, even if those children were harmed in a particular kind of way,
Right.
a harm.
Yeah.
So we'll have
All
to be
right.
satisfied with leaving it at that, I think. But it's
Yeah.
totally fascinating,
Yes.
the topic.
All right. So,
Okay, well, thanks for listening.
yeah, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for listening to Conversations in Bioethics, a podcast brought to you by the Cleveland State Department of Philosophy and Comparative Religion. Produced by faculty member Tony Nicoletti in conjunction with the Center for Instructional Technology and Distance Learning. For more information about the Department of Philosophy and Comparative Religion course offerings, please visit our website at csuohio.edu or call 216-687-3900.